Hello, everyone. Sorry, I just lost my voice. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're going to be getting started in just a moment. The speakers are just arriving right now. It seems like everyone's here. We'll be coming to the stage shortly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah Krinsky. I'm one of the rabbis here at Addis Israel. And on behalf of the clergy team and our congregation, we're so overjoyed to welcome you here and to be hosting this wonderful event that was organized by the Israel Policy Forum in partnership with the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. It's really an honor to have this gathering in this space. So I just want to share, today was my first day back from maternity leave. So thank you. My head is sort of barely fastened on my body right now. But I basically spent the day catching up with people and asking people over and over again, how are you? And the answer that I got over and over again was some version of, which I think meant I'm hurting. Right? The answer over and over again was, I'm hurting. There is so much in the world right now to be confused by and hurt by and despondent over and hopeless and helpless over. And I felt it in the air. And I think what people are searching for in this moment is information and knowledge and wisdom and perspective. And they're also searching for some example that they can hold on to of what the world could look like. And that is what the gathering tonight, that is what these experts are able to provide. They're able to teach us, right? These are three of the foremost policy experts. They have tremendous knowledge that they will impart. But more than that, they're going to model something for us. They're going to model listening and engaging and being present and showing us just a taste of what it is that we can imagine that the world might look like. And so that makes this gathering not just an important one, but genuinely a holy one. So we're thrilled to have each of you here. Thank you all for being here and for all that you will share. And I'm now going to turn it over to Larry Haas from the JCRC.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Good evening, everyone. I'm Larry Haas, the Israel co-chair at the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. I'm delighted to also welcome you to tonight's event, which we are very honored to be a part of. I want to thank the rabbi and all the clergy and staff at Addis for hosting us tonight, and of course to thank the Israel Policy Forum, David Halpern, Avi Weinrib, our speakers, the entire IPF team for always putting together interesting and timely conversations and analysis on Israel and the region. I also want to thank Adam Odesser and Charlotte Barrios and their colleagues at the JCRC who do lots of the work to make events like this possible and who let me stand up here and pretend that I had anything to do with it. As we all know, we're meeting here at a tenuous moment as reflected by the rabbi's comments as we approach the end of the first phase of the hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. And we don't know whether the coming days will bring the next phase of the hostage deal or more war between the two sides. We've all ridden a roller coaster of emotions over the last 16 months. The agony of October 7th, the joy of seeing some hostages return to their families, the anguish of learning that some hostages won't come home alive, and of learning firsthand what the others who have come home have been through, and the anger of watching hostages paraded through the streets of Gaza. And of course, caught in the middle of all of this turmoil are millions of people who our panelists are going to be referencing tonight. The millions of Israelis and Palestinians who, whatever their differences over how to get there, I think overwhelmingly would rather live in peace than fear. I want you to know the JCRC will continue to serve our Jewish community in the Washington area, provide opportunities for our community to come together as we're coming together tonight, to engage in discussion on timely issues, and to advocate for Israel, the return of the remaining hostages, and a more peaceful and secure future for both Israelis and Palestinians. Now, on a far less somber note, I am honored to invite Susie Gelman, a member of Addis and a board member and former board chair of the Israel Policy Forum, to come up here, push me aside, and say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. So, as Larry mentioned, I'm Susie Gelman, board member and immediate past chair of Israel Policy Forum, and a proud member since 1980 of Addis Israel Congregation, so welcome to our shul. It's really a pleasure to welcome you here tonight, and thank you so much for coming. And I also want to acknowledge David Sherman, the current chair of Israel Policy Forum. So thank you to Addis and to the Jewish Community Relations Council for being such invaluable partners, not only this evening, but throughout several years. You've hosted, Addis and JCRC have hosted many IPF events here, and we're really grateful. So I'm really delighted to welcome all of you here to tonight's important conversation. IPF's mission is to build support among American policymakers and community leaders for the advancement of a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to ensure a secure Jewish democratic Israel. In this moment of profound tragedy and uncertainty, the stakes for Israelis, Palestinians, and the region have never been higher. So now more than ever, we need thoughtful, informed, and constructive dialogue. That's why I'm especially grateful to be joined by three distinguished experts, all of whom are good friends, who bring deep knowledge and invaluable insights to this discussion. Dr. Sheila Efron is Israel Policy Forum's research director based in Tel Aviv, and she's the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Senior Fellow. Ibrahim Eid Dalalsha is the founder and director of the Ramallah-based Horizon Center for Political Studies and Media Outreach. And finally, Rachel Brandenburg, who grew up here, and her parents Fanny and Dan, longtime members of the Shul. We are very blessed that Rachel recently became Israel Policy Forum's Washington Managing Director and Senior Fellow. So each of our three panelists will offer a unique and critical perspective on the challenges and opportunities ahead. And now it's my privilege, my great privilege, to introduce someone who's really been instrumental in shaping Israel Policy Forum's vision and impact, our CEO, David Halperin. David.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you again to ADIS, to the JCRC, and thank you, Susie. I think this program is, it's a pretty generic title, Conflict at a Crossroads, but it really hits the nail on the head, frankly, because we really genuinely are meeting at a time of great uncertainty in terms of the directions that the region may take. On the one hand, we are seeing enormous opportunity after a year of conflict. Israel's strengthened position vis-a-vis Iran, the decimation of Hezbollah, the change in Syria, and the ceasefires that have emerged in Gaza that enable the possibility of expanding calm in the region and exploring the possibility of regional normalization, versus the tragedy and the pain and, frankly, the increased extremism in the discourse and dialogue that we have been seeing on all sides of this discussion and the debate, even more, of course, fueled on October 7, but even more so even in the last week with the announcement of the deaths, the murder and captivity of the Bibas family, whose funeral is taking place tomorrow. And so it's really we really genuinely are at a crossroads, and I just want to echo what Susie said about the opportunity to sit with colleagues who come at this from the perspective of those who've worked in Washington and understand our government and how it's been working on such challenges. Our colleague Shira in Israel, who has worked within the Israeli defense establishment and understands the thinking in that arena, and Ibrahim, who for years has been following the Palestinian arena, and of course has come from Ramallah to be here with us tonight. So first I want to thank you all for engaging in this kind of dialogue. And I want to start, Shira, with you. If you could just bring us up to speed on where we are at in Gaza specifically, with the uncertainty of the state of the hostage negotiations, the state of this ceasefire. How are Israelis and the Israeli security establishment, Israeli political scene, thinking about these critical days to come?
Okay, so it's a long question, but first, good evening, and thank you for having us here. And hi, Susie, and hi, Michael, and it's so nice to meet Rachel's family. I'm so happy she joined us. So where do we start? So I'll just, the last update on the news is that there was a hiccup or hurdle, as expected. You may have heard with the hostage ceasefire agreement. In return, it's so awful to talk about this in terms of deals and exchanges, right? We're talking about people, but in return for the 6 live hostages that came back on Saturday and the 4 bodies, the Bivas and the Lifshitz, Israel was supposed to release 602 prisoners. Israel, in protest over those disgraceful Hamas ceremonies that frankly became, I don't know how you can make them even more disgraceful. Israel in protest decided that they're delaying their release, but this was resolved. And tomorrow, I think there's going to be the release of the 4 remaining bodies of stage 1 of this agreement, and the prisoners are going to be released at the same time. And I got to tell you, it's so awful. But when we looked at this in advance, just looking at stage 1, we said we hope we will get to the end of stage 1 because we figured that Hamas may not have the incentive to finish stage 1 if they thought we're not going to get to stage 2. And not happy. There's nothing, there's nothing positive about this, but at least some people are coming home, right? And others are going to be buried in Israel, and that's positive. And I think we have an indication that Israel does not want to the same considerations that existed before the Israeli government, and we can speak about them. Netanyahu doesn't want to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor and to discuss the day after the war, which are the terms of stage 2 of the agreement. But Israel did offer to sort of extend and expand the first stage. So according to the same keys, Hamas will release live prisoners. Live hostages and deceased hostages, and Israel will continue to release prisoners, and we will do so at least until the end of Ramadan. So it's about a month. We might continue to see the same things we've been seeing so far, and this the least we can do. I think this is where we are at the moment. So there's reason to be optimistic, at least about the next few weeks in terms of the ceasefire sustaining and more people coming home. Steve Witkoff, the President Trump's special envoy, was supposed to come to Israel and the region tomorrow for 4 or 5 days of diplomacy. He's doing other things. He's now busy fixing Ukraine, Russia. But this was resolved before him. And frankly, we had spoken earlier a few hours ago, and we thought this would not be resolved without his direct intervention, but it was. So that's where we are. In terms of the change, what happens in Gaza, in a sense, we are seeing the ceasefire has had some positive effects, but also negative effects. So the negative effect that I see, of course, is the fact that we see Hamas, a fraction of what it used to be, but still the most potent power, right, in Gaza, basically displaying acts of de facto governance, which is, I think, something no one wanted to see again. And I had a bet with a friend, a colleague of ours, I won't disclose names, but I remember speaking with him before the ceasefire started on that Saturday, and I said, I bet you tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. when the ceasefire starts, Hamas is going to be in uniform. And he said, no way. We were both not right, because Hamas was in uniform already at 7:30 a.m., before the ceasefire went into effect. So the fact that the failure to come up with sort of a day after alternative and to think of, as you dismantle Hamas, you allow something else to grow, left us with a situation that I think is almost like the worst of all worlds, right? Because we paid all this price for this to be another round. And this goes to Israelis and Palestinians. But I hope it's late, but not too late, and we can talk about what needs to be done about this later. But this is in terms of the de facto governance. But what happens in Gaza is that we've seen as part of the ceasefire agreement, there are large quantities of aid going in. It's primarily food, not the right food. People in Gaza will complain they have way too many trucks of potato chips, but there is food going into Gaza, 4,200 trucks per week. That's part of the agreement. Part of the agreement was also to have 60,000 caravans. We're not even close to anything. There's no factory in the world that could produce 60,000 caravans at this rate, so we're not there. And rubble removal equipment. So you see some bulldozers in Gaza, and that made a lot of noise. It's actually being driven by Egyptian drivers, but still, this is an issue. But in terms of this conversation about reconstruction, and can Gaza be reconstruction turned into a Riviera, and how do you do this, and the fact is that because there are ideas out there, all the ad hoc emergency recovery efforts are stuck. So nothing is happening. So if you want to move, I'll give you an example. There's an organization that wants to move a field hospital from the south to the north, because now a lot of people moved back to the northern part of Gaza, but there are no field hospitals there. But they're scared of doing it because they're saying, wait, what if we go back to war tomorrow? So nothing is happening on the ground in substantial ways that improves the lives substantially of Palestinians in Gaza, especially except for the food. Now, maybe I'll just end with this. I think the conversation in Israel is very much there are preparations for two things to happen, either for continuation of some sort of stage 1, maybe stage 2, waiting for the Arab special summit in March 4th to come up with a plan that is a counter offer to President Trump's, I don't know, idea, vision, what is this thing for Gaza? And then, I want to be respectful. I'm trying. And this is one option. I admit that the second option that is more discussed is resumption of fighting, going back to war, and the war plans are very much where they stopped last time. So it's northern Gaza, clearing, all this. It would look very different. It would be very. It will be intense fighting, okay? If you need to clear the northern part of Gaza again, it'll be shortages of humanitarian supplies. I mean, everything, go back to the beginning of the war. This is what we're going to see. This is in the plan. And there's another sort of like within that, a strain of thought in Israel that I think the only place that really took President Trump's idea seriously is in Israel. So Israel set up a directorate. The Ministry of Defense set up a directorate for the voluntary migration of Gazans. And there are some thinking of how this, who wants to move, where will they go, how this will be done, who's going to drive them, who's going to ship them, who's going to where. So there is a discussion that is being taken seriously in Israel, and I think waiting for Witkoff and the Arabs and Godot, maybe we'll find, we will go in one of those pathways. So I hope I addressed everything.
There's so much to unpack, and I know we are going to do a Q&A session, don't worry. We'll get to questions as well, but I do want to just set the stage. Ibrahim, you're coming to us from Ramallah, and the West Bank hasn't received so much attention over the last year. In fact, before October 7, it was Gaza that wasn't getting so much attention, and all of the focus was on the West Bank, and of course it's been the opposite, but now we are in the midst of a rather significant IDF operation in the north of Gaza, the northern West Bank. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of how things are in the West Bank, where you're living, and a sense of how things have been changed or are different. I have many more follow-ups, but I'm curious if you could set the stage for us.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you for having me. Before I address that question, if I may, I just have to completely disagree with everything that Shira said, specifically on the question of whether or not it was Witkoff who actually pulled this agreement. Apparently, or at least this is what Hamas and other people are saying.
Now
the one that is coming. That the fact that he threatened not to come to the region is what made them and pushed them to do it. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I mean, it lays back responsibility that I think so far, there is a consensus that Trump and Witkoff basically they got us into the beginning of the agreement.
We disagree.
And no, it's just you're an Israeli, I'm a Palestinian. We have to disagree. It just doesn't work. Thank you again. The West Bank, in fact, is like it's as David said and indicated. I think it has been under the radar screen. Throughout the war and even 2-3 years before the war erupted in Gaza, and the problems are frankly numerous and multi sort of like layers throughout the. It has to do with not only Israeli military operations that are happening already and impacting civilian population much more than they are impacting militants, and I'll actually explain why. Second, because of several measures that were taken that impacted the general population rather than the specific militants, including the internal closures between the West Bank towns. So it's not only the closure that would take people from West Bank to Israel, but also within the West Bank. 3 is like the financial and economic hardships that the PA has been going through. The PA, not in terms of the individual officials, but in terms of employer of more than 200,000 Palestinian staffers who have been impacted with half salaries, in part because of the Israeli policy of deducting tax revenues from the Palestinian Authority. And lastly is 150,000 Palestinian employees who've been working in Israel and in Israeli settlements in the West Bank who have been stopped in order to stop basically working in Israel. All of that is, describes, I think, what the West Bank have been going through before the war and specifically after the war. When we travel, when we come out of, of the West Bank, and this is not an exaggeration, I think since the war started, you would have to plan for at least 3 or 4 roadblocks that would be, that would add at least 4 hours. And someone like me who's, lucky enough to actually have the opportunity to travel around the world, I know that 4 hours is enough to get from Amman, where we actually fly from, usually, to France, for example. So, these are, you can imagine what would happen and what happens and what people actually meet when it comes to, people who would want to go to students to schools, to hospitals, socializing, whatever it is. I think the worst part, that is in terms of describing how life is in the West Bank, but I want to actually also take it at another level, which is how do most people perceive this? The Gaza, situation, Hamas did the terrible attacks on October 7, and there was a war, and people in Gaza had to suffer because Hamas, that is controlling Gaza, did this on their behalf, so Hamas is to blame. Well, that made sense until you get to a situation in the West Bank where there was no October 7 attacks, and there hasn't really been, like the PA, with all the problems and deficiencies in the PA system, it continues to hold security coordination with Israel and with the Israeli forces. And I think professional Israeli security establishment acknowledge that, regardless of what the politicians say or do not on that specific topic. And the end result is that people are suffering from the harsh realities and conditions as a spillover from what happened in Gaza. Whether it's actually less or more today or these days after the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, and people listen to Israeli media a lot, and there was an agreement that was not kept in secret between Israeli Prime Minister and the Minister Smotrich, who decided to stay in the coalition, and the deal was that there will be a second front of war in the West Bank. And there you go with, displacing people from the refugee camps. At least, 900 to 950 people have been killed actually throughout the past year in the West Bank. And people may dispute numbers, but at least 50% of those are civilians that have nothing to do with militants or gunmen or any of the armed formations that we did have in the West Bank before. And this translates into people's minds that it doesn't really matter whether you do or live in an area where you have a government that coordinates with Israel, or you do live in a territory that actually fights Israel. And that, in my opinion, falls more into Hamas's and those kind of militant organizations sort of like narrative that, at the end of the day, this is an enemy that is targeting all Palestinians, regardless of whether, they do security coordination or not. Now, that might be a wrong conclusion, seeing it from, an objective standpoint, but this is truly what actually happens. And I think this is one of the narratives that people like me and others try to always fight, and we have extreme difficulty in doing that while, there is no alternative path to the current violent path that we have in the West Bank and pretty much in Gaza as well.
So I know there's a lot more questions I have for you, but I do want to bring in Rachel, because usually the challenge is to describe what's happening in Israel and the Palestinian arena, but now the challenge is really what's happening in Washington, Rachel. What do you make of what has been an unprecedented, really just over a month of the Trump second-term presidency, and you were just in Israel, a week ago in a series of meetings. So I'm curious, what are some of the takeaways that you or headlines that you've been really thinking about that we should be thinking, on how the United States is impacting all that's taking place?
Thank you. Two big, very different questions, and thank you for having us. It does feel like I'm in the wrong seat, because usually I'm sitting where all of you are sitting or running after my kids, but pleased to be here. What to make of the Trump administration? You know, there are a few things I was thinking about before President Trump came back into office that I sort of learned from the first administration. And I keep asking myself, are they still true? Have they changed? One of those is that he doesn't really like war. He came in saying, you know, ceasefire has to happen before I start. He has gone back and forth between the Gaza war has to end, and now recently, Bibi Netanyahu can do whatever he wants. But another one of the sort of things, lessons learned that I had taken away was that he also doesn't really believe that the United States should be paying for other people's problems, not in the form of security assistance. There was a time when we were asking Qatar to pay us back for hosting our military base back in his first administration. I think we're seeing that play out in similar ways. I also think we saw policy made by Twitter for the first time in the first administration, and we're seeing that all over again. One of the dangers there are many dangers, but in this arena, I think, and Shira alluded to this, is Israel seems to be one of the few places that is taking seriously this idea of a Gaza Riviera, because it sounds great. And when you sort of put that out there and don't have the people to work out the details, don't really have a plan, most of the world thinks it's not going to happen, but a few of the actors who are really critical to making better things happen just kind of wait and see what that plan, sort of when the plan comes. A lot of things can fill in the void of what I consider sort of proper governance and policymaking and politicking to move things in a better direction with respect to Gaza and a long-term ceasefire, reconstruction, Israeli policies in the West Bank. It seems to me that one can debate how much leverage the Biden administration had in their waning days. I think over this conflict, not that much. But there were still sort of guardrails that checked international actors, particularly those that we consider allies and partners, and kind of prevented them from pursuing their worst instincts. And I think in this case, those are gone. And particularly for Israeli politicians, Trump has now directly said, Prime Minister Netanyahu can do whatever he wants. Really, I don't care. So I think there's a lot of danger in that. That is also one of the things I heard last week in Israel, sort of, oh, well, we're going to wait and see what the Arabs say when they have the summit. I was there before the Friday meeting, so there was still sort of some hope staked on, let's see what Egypt brings to the table on Friday. Nothing really seems to have come of that, at least publicly. So now March 4th. Another was still, and everyone here knows this, there is still so much fear and trauma and not really much trust in their own government, nonetheless in their neighbors. I was with family over Shabbat, most of whom are Shomer Shabbat, and they recognized that at noon, I think it was the bodies were, I've lost track of whether it was bodies on Saturday or live hostages, but there was a release that was supposed to happen, and whispering sort of toward the end of services, oh, do we think all hell is going to break loose? Like, what does that mean? What does Trump mean? So this sense that really could have been a thing. Admirably, they had enough discipline to not go check their phones, and we were like ourselves in a hotel, so there was nobody checking their phone to tell them what was happening. But it was interesting to me that was so much at the front of their minds in terms of the time, but also the potential for Trump's words to really translate into action. There too, nothing happened. One of the other things that I heard in a lot of conversations, partially because we spoke to some military folks, partially because we were in the north for a day, is really this orientation toward Iran. And certainly the fear of Iran, the need for an attack on Iran, I think, and this relates to one of the things that I think still holds true about President Trump, is he doesn't want to get us involved in a war with Iran, so I'm curious to see how that plays out. And on the northern border in particular, where you have a new regime in Syria and a new government in Lebanon and a significantly degraded Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, whether Israel is able to sort of pivot into a posture that both accounts for their security and legitimate needs to sort of defend their borders, but also takes advantage of what I think could be strategic opportunities to engage the new Syrian government, who aren't really calling for Israel's dissolution. They don't really have an enemy on the Syrian border in the way that they did previously. And in the case of Lebanon also, where there's sort of a moment to maybe work with a new government, not that normalization with either of those countries is coming anytime soon, but I fear that they are going to miss the opportunity. This Israeli government is going to miss the opportunity to turn those into more constructive relationships. And you don't really have a U.S. to push them in that direction right now.
Yeah. Ibrahim, I want to ask you about the Palestinian reaction to Trump's proposal on Gaza, which sort of speaks to the fears of Palestinians of displacement, of sort of reliving the 1948 experience. But I also want to ask about that reaction, meaning to Trump, and also want to ask about just the reaction to October 7th, because I think the last week, the news about the Bibas family, for many, it felt like reliving October 7th all over again, and looking for the condemnations and looking for leadership to stand up and talk about how killing babies is wrong and just call terrorism terrorism. And I wonder if you could speak to the Palestinian reaction, both to Trump's ideas and the Palestinian reaction to October 7, and this. What many in the community have been asking is, where is the Palestinian condemnation of this sort of action, which I think folks would like to hear. I don't know, it's up to you.
I'd rather actually start with the reaction to the October 7 attacks, because I think my analysis, my feeling, my experience, my sort of interaction and engagement with people is straightforward, and I'm conveying to you in a non-official capacity what I think most people have been through. The October 7 attacks that were carried out by Hamas at 6:30 that morning were in fact followed almost instantly or immediately. I mean, yeah, it took a few hours, but basically the same day, with intensive bombing that I think didn't leave a Palestinian standing to say, oh, those were attacks against Israeli civilians, so I condemn that. At the same time, there was massive bombing against Palestinian civilians inside Gaza, with many people being killed, and I think that got people in a state of confusion. And I'm not here sort of like defending anyone. On the official levels, for example, there was reluctance, especially on part of the Palestinian Authority, leaving Hamas aside, to actually issue a condemnation for the attacks, although privately they did that. And with every, like foreign dignitaries, delegations, and others did that. But in terms of the public reaction to it, I think, when it comes to babies and women, and you take my word for it, and I stand corrected, but there is no, in my opinion, there is no Palestinian other than militants who would actually justify or think that killing Israeli civilians and Israeli babies or Israeli children is a justified act. In fact, one of the Hamas leaders, in his own way, wanted to actually, instead of condemning, he wanted to deflect responsibility over this, in a sign of actually not being accepted to endorse killing civilians, especially when it comes to women and children. That's the culture. And what he said is that we lost control. The IDF, stationed around Gaza, they collapsed quickly, and there was lots of civilians who came out, and there was a mess. That was like a way of trying to avoid, condemnation, but also avoid responsibility over it. What I'm saying is that the Palestinian public in general, I think, were traumatized very much like the Israelis. Each side identified, with his own, narrative. I know, and I overwatch Israeli media, and I have many Israeli friends. And I know that even Israeli public was not fully aware, or did not even pay attention, and was not really briefed on what happens in Gaza, what's happening in Gaza, because there are, I think if you come to check reality, even with independent and international, not necessarily Hamas, I'm not talking about Hamas structures in Gaza announcing figures or playing games with data. I think that at least 50% of people who were killed in Gaza were civilians. it's not a blame game, whether it's Israel to blame or Hamas to blame. It's essentially the experience that people go through of seeing such a high number of civilians being killed. As much as they would identify, if this was a situation where this was an attack and there was like a period of time to actually form an opinion and react, I would assure you that many Palestinians would have actually came public to condemn an attack against Israeli civilians. The problem was that the war started so massively to a point that both, I think, societies went into a traumatic reaction almost immediately, seeing their side of suffering and, not necessarily deliberately turning a blind eye, but not really looking at the other side. And I think, we both sides, I think Palestinians and Israelis right now continue to live in a trauma. And I think, we need time to heal in order to, to get like the right voices. I mean, I can tell you that I, of course, and it's not even, I don't really feel myself compelled to say it, that I condemn not only the October 7 attacks. In fact, it's not more than condemnation. I actually, one of those Palestinians, and there are many people like me, who actually believe that this conflict will never be resolved in violence. In fact, if Palestinians do not prove first that the creation of a Palestinian state and independence is going to be an additional security and safety layer to Israelis who live in the same homeland, if you will, it will never happen. So it's much deeper than just being diplomatic or like coming to an apathy with the community of the Israelis and actually say I condemn it. It's about me too. It's like violence hits you, but it also hits me back. So it's more of a reasonable, thoughtful, and I think this awareness is actually growing. This sense of awareness and realization that this conflict is not to be resolved by violence. This conflict is to be resolved by securing the needs of each other and meeting the Israeli security needs and complex. This may not be I have also to mention that all those polls that were conducted during the first weeks and months on Palestinians saying people or Palestinian people, 70% and 80% of Palestinians supported October attacks, in my opinion, are scientifically wrong, emotionally wrong. You don't come to people actually, especially those in Gaza, under fire and say, hey, what do you think about peace process? I mean, what do you think about the October 7 attacks? While he's in fire, he's not going to identify with the other side. It's like almost natural. So it's the whole thing. I think, again, we need time to heal from this. And the question at crossroads, which side we want to pick? Continue to be on the violent side or actually take the other right, in my opinion, direction to resolve the conflict? The first question.
Sorry, I apologize, but I do wanted to know about the. Yeah. No, it's important. The question is about the reaction to the Trump proposal in Gaza to create the Riviera. Yes.
Okay. In terms of even across the Palestinian public, you would hear different opinions. And, people would actually say, hey, this president of the U.S., Trump, he said what he he did what he said he would do in his, first, in terms of the closure of the consulate in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Proclamation, and many other steps that he did. So there was a level, but I think at the average people's situation or reaction, especially in Gaza, I'm sorry, but it's not taken seriously. And there are many reasons why. I mean, for one, saying that they will go to Jordan and Egypt, it's simply like is reflective of not understanding the reality. Like neither Jordan nor Egypt would take Palestinians. In fact, if actually, they say that Gaza is an open prison, the largest in the world. So yeah, if you find a country that is willing to take 2 million Palestinians from Gaza and give them the choice, maybe 500,000 of Palestinians in Gaza will leave, and the other 1.5 million will stay. So the whole proposal was not really taken seriously. If the Trump administration decides to take in Gazans to the U.S., yeah, I think that 1 million probably will come, and 1 million will stay behind. With the birth rate that you actually have, 4.6, in 10 years' time, we're back again to 2 million. I don't think that it was taken seriously at the public level. At the political level, the leaderships, I think they were shocked by it, but also relieved because it got Jordan and Egypt to actually jump in and stand against the Trump administration rather than the Palestinians coming against him. And that's, I think, exactly what happened. Because for Jordan, it's an existential issue to actually talk about, bringing in, I'm not going back to history in the 60s and 70s, that the clashes and the Palestinian, movements trying to take over Jordan regime. Look at the composition of the demographics of Jordan with 70% of Palestinian origin, bringing those 2 million, Palestinians to Jordan will essentially, in 1 decade, you would think that this will turn over the whole situation there. And I'm sorry, even in terms of security implications, South Lebanon will become nothing because that would be the more than 670 kilometers of affront against the Israeli occupation. And that pushes people, again, I'm sorry to say it, but it pushes people to, the most radical interpretations of the insane ideology of having to fight the Jews from across the river. There are some teachings in Islamic, mainly used by militants, that actually say that the judgment day will not come before you fight the Jews across the river. And the Jordan River is the place, so it's actually happening. It just fuels an insane sort of ideology and militancy. But none of that was, I think, taken, people were not sleepless over, and they were thinking, oh, the US is going to own us? How does that happen? They're going to come and physically force us? How does that happen? People did not really take it as a serious threat. I think politicians have exploited that in order to actually gather with the Arab countries and see how they would react to it rather than the Palestinians. That's in a nutshell. I didn't really get the sense that anyone was seriously concerned about it.
Yeah, but sure, as you said, it was taken seriously in Israel, and you wrote in the New York Times a couple weeks ago that this was certainly a gift to Netanyahu politically. Could you give us a sense of where Israel is at today politically? 16 months after October 7th, with Netanyahu seemingly strong yet again. What do you make of the current political discourse in Israel and the prospects for political change, either now or long term?
I'll try to be brief because also Israeli politics is my least favorite topic in the world.
No, I'm sorry.
And frankly, I only do red team. I only do Arabs. So in a good way, I don't. It's not. But I think of the 11 months before October 7th, right? You had at one point almost 1 million Israelis on the streets for a clause on legal reform issues, right? We thought that this government was not going to survive for other reasons. And it's true that it's homogeneous in some ways, this government, but also very heterogeneous in other ways. Then comes October 7th, really the biggest catastrophe to the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Under the watch of Netanyahu, who, if he ever allows a national inquiry, to come out, they'll be investigating the intelligence failure and the devastating operational failure. That's all IDF. But there was also strategic failure, right? That said that Hamas is an asset. And the directive, and I'm telling you, this was the directive. Anyone who had served a day in the IDF since 2000, and it's not after 2007, but in the last decade before, or even 15 years, was keep Hamas in power. This was the directive. Keep Hamas in power, but weakened and deterred. And, these are very vague terms. Deterrence, we can go into the theory. You have deterrence until you don't have deterrence. And weakened, it was definitely not weakened. So this disaster. Everyone thinks the government will have to fall, right? 16th month in, it's gaining in the polls. There's still, polling before election, without actually having elections, is kind of worthless, right? Because people say stuff and then it's not what they actually vote. But we see that the coalition is gaining. Likud is still the biggest party. If Naftali Bennett joins the race, then his party becomes the biggest party, but it used to have a bigger gap. There was a poll a few days ago, so it was the 27 seats versus 26, but it's pretty close to Likud, okay? And Bennett, in previous, it's not his first time, right? He always performs better in the polling, substantially better in the polling than in actually in the elections themselves. So we don't know what's going to happen. But still, elections have not been announced. Netanyahu will not break into elections. This government technically has 2 more years to go. And they will not break into elections. They will not go to elections until Netanyahu will be sure that he has a good chance of winning. We see that if Bennett runs, he's not going to take votes from this coalition necessarily. Maybe 2 seats from the Likud. That's what I was saying. But it's mostly seats from Benny Gantz, from Yair Lapid, from even a little bit from Lieberman, from Yair Golan. So in a sense, if you think about like the bloc, right? There's this bloc. It doesn't really matter who has the biggest party. This coalition doesn't fare well. Most of the Israeli public is not with it, but it's also not at a place where it's like doesn't have a complete mandate from the public. Yair Golan is gaining, which is why you see some bizarre performances at the Knesset. He was trying to change the name of the faction from Labor to the Democrats. And some of the Likud, Rotman or someone has said they're not allowing them. It's the election committee. They're not allowing them because they're not democratic, because they're doing things that are not democratic, so they're not allowed to do it. So they're turning the Knesset committee, professional committees, into like a Likud branch. It's a circus. I will say that this is, it's if you look at polling of the Israeli public on the key issues of completing the hostage agreement, including stage 2, even at the price of ending the war, most of the Israeli public wants this. Most of the Israeli Jewish public wants this. National inquiry, most of the Israeli public wants it, and also going to elections. So if this government gets, again, the mandate from the public, so be it, right? Still a democracy, still. So the public is not with the government on the key issues. I think what we are... So again, I don't see elections anytime soon. We don't know when we'll see elections. Technically, it's supposed the date is November 2026. So we could get there. What happened is, and I think some of us were joking, that when that Netanyahu-Trump meeting in the White House, in the Oval Office, was basically like a budget transfer gift, because there's the budget that needs to be transferred. They need to pass the budget in March. And it's not because of Gaza, it's because of the Haredi draft bill and all these other, and now we're seeing the compromises where the Haredis will have to compromise, but it's very clearly that we're not breaking this coalition. So I don't see elections coming anytime soon, and we have a very weak opposition. No one in Israel criticized the voluntary migration plan. Yair Lapid is in town. He said that every liberal should support voluntary migration. Now, I will tell you, I don't say it outside because I'm scared, but I did some service with COGAT, the coordinating body that in reserves now since the war. If you try to get a Palestinian out of Gaza, it's very difficult. We don't let them go out. We don't let anyone go out. And the Egyptians don't let anyone go out. So this whole voluntary migration idea, I buy the argument that President Trump and Witkoff saw the pictures from Gaza and they're like, how can you live here, right? This is like, you'll have better lives elsewhere. Not that this is about quality of life conflict, but I buy this. This is not what the Israelis are thinking. So to your conversation, I think you talk about like where the Palestinian society is. I assume you know where the Israeli society is. There's no empathy, understandably so, but you also don't have an opposition that challenges the government in meaningful ways. So we'll have a lot of Bibi. And Bibi is now, they think that they have a green light to do whatever they want from Washington. And they say that this is the international community is with us, as if Trump represents all of the international community.
So I want to go to Q&A, but I want to ask Rachel one more thing, because it would seem there is a stop to, or a block to doing anything they want, and that is the prospect, in theory, of normalization with Saudi Arabia. In some ways, this idea of normalization with Saudi Arabia has served as a check against some of these impulses, because it would seemingly remove that crown jewel expansion of the Abraham Accords from the equation. Rachel, you spent a lot of time thinking and working on the issue of Saudi normalization over the last year, and I'm curious, what do you make of the role of Saudi Arabia in this equation?
Sure. I think, I remember shortly after October 7th looking around the region and purely my personal opinion, looking at the Crown Prince in Saudi as one of the potentially had the highest chance of being willing to stand up with a strategic vision. And I do think with Trump in power again, on this issue, Saudi holds even more cards. There's a lot that Saudi Arabia wants from the United States. I think the idea that normalization was something they had to go along with was sort of the approach of the last U.S. administration. We've heard President Trump say time and time again, and Special Envoy Witkoff since, normalization is on the table. We're going to get to normalization this year. I think with every passing week and comment related to Gaza, whether the Riviera or Saudi will do whatever I want, don't worry, they'll take the Palestinians, the Trump administration is doing themselves no favors. And I'm not sure to what extent they understand that Saudi Arabia has its own politics. The Crown Prince has been very dedicated to what he calls Vision 2030, the sort of social and economic reform plan. And they've made a lot of progress. He's made quite a number of reforms on the social and economic level, domestic issues that many Saudis like. There is still an opposition in Saudi. There's still members of his family. There's still sort of the religious guard who are quiet and kind of were taken off the streets and in some cases put in the Ritz? Whatever, put in effectively jail for a while. But he does have his own politics to deal with. And I think we've watched over the last month, 5 weeks of the Trump administration, him sort of climbing a higher and higher ladder, even on the issue of normalization, yes, but only in the case that there is, initially it was a credible path toward a Palestinian state, or time-bound irreversible steps toward a Palestinian state. And then the minute after the Gaza Riviera idea was put out, I think it was 4 a.m. in Riyadh when they put out a statement signed by the Crown Prince saying, only when there is a Palestinian state will we move forward with normalization. And I hear that the Trump administration gets the sense, and we hear this publicly too, that they can just make Saudi push. The Crown Prince doesn't really care. He really wants normalization. He really wants what there is to gain from the United States. But I'm not sure that is real. I think he really does have concern for his own domestic political standing. I think there is still, it would still be a big deal for Saudi to normalize relations with Israel. And the last 16 months have made that much more difficult domestically for the Crown Prince, for Saudi Arabia, because there has been sort of this awakening to the Palestinian cause that wasn't really a topic of conversation for young Saudis until post-October 7th. And now they've watched images of destruction in Gaza. They've heard the international conversation. And for Saudi, for the UAE, for sort of Gulf countries that had gotten used to popular sentiment not really caring, now people care, and that's something that they have to contend with. So I sort of watched President Trump, I think of like throwing spaghetti at the wall with all of these deal makings, Russia, Ukraine, Saudi, Israel, Gaza, ceasefire, and we'll see which one sticks, but my sense that Saudi-Israel normalization could happen and sort of this deal of the century would be a near-term aspiration for him has diminished quite a bit.
So I'm sure you all have lots of questions for our panelists. We don't have a microphone, I don't believe, so I think we just do raising of hands would be great. And I will start here with the gentleman in the... Yeah, I can. Why don't I give mine?
I'm just going to yell out real quick.
Okay. A question of West Bank annexation. Donald Trump had mentioned in his press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu that there would be an announcement coming in about 4 weeks or so. That was, about 3 weeks or so ago. What do you all make of it? What are you hearing? If we can give a quick round, yeah.
I think President Trump has mentioned that in response to questions that in 4 weeks or in next month he will actually give a position on it. What we expect is that he will approve Israeli annexation. I think at the official and public levels is that he will definitely come out with a statement or a position that would support what Smotrich, the Israeli far-right minister, is saying, that 2025 is the year of sovereignty or annexation in the West Bank. It's not that people don't take it seriously, but I'll try to explain how I think collectively we Palestinian people and I think official circles look at this situation. The damage that, for example, when it comes to relocation of Gazans, what does that mean in a political sense? It means that the Trump administration is embracing far-right Israeli positions, which in fact will not necessarily be implemented. People will not be relocated, not by force and not voluntarily, but it does actually waste opportunity of building and trying to get Palestinians and Israelis back on a track along with Saudis and others in the region. So all that is translating into, all those announcements are not really making a difference. It's making the positive difference, but it's actually making the situation worse. But not necessarily in the deeds themselves, because, I think, for people who have not been to the West Bank, de facto, the West Bank settlements are annexed to Israel in terms of infrastructure, roads, services, Israeli law, and how it applies. I mean, Israeli police, not the Israeli army, is the one that takes care of Israeli security. That is part of the Israeli civil law and settlements. So it is effectively annexed. It's similar to the situation where Israel annexed the Golan Heights and then Trump came to endorse it 40 years after the fact. But what does that mean? What did that mean in the immediate day after? It's just pushed any possible peace deal between then Syria and Israel further. In the Palestinian context, I think the hopes is that we would get into a different situation with the new U.S. administration. But Trump has proven, I think, for the Palestinians that now we're on the defense and trying to prevent what is worse and how it actually translates. And specifically the annexation and the Gaza relocation bring back to Palestinian memories and reality that this is the far-right, the extreme far-right Israeli positions, because transfer and relocation and annexation is things that I personally, who's now getting to be 60, remember when I was a kid, from Kahana and Rahbam Ze'evi and many other Israeli. So that's not new in that sense. But coming from the President of the United States, it's a very, it's basically saying that don't count on us anymore. We're not going to do anything constructive or positive. We're supporting this side, even of the Israeli map. Political map. So that I think how we perceive it.
But the goal, things change, right? So annexation in Israel is not viewed as a Kahanist idea, or as there's a consensus, and I think probably Yair Golan, the only left Israeli, the left-wing Israeli party now, a Jewish party, would support annexation of the Jordan Valley, for instance. To be honest, I don't know if the Trump administration made a decision yet. I think what Rachel said is correct, that there are two things that are correct. First, that they would basically let Israel do whatever they want, what the Israelis want. And there's no pushback against annexation in Israel by no one. So you have to understand, this is not challenged in the conversation, not substantially. The only ones who can sort of prevent this are the Saudis. If they are sending a message, this for us, we will never take less than what the Emiratis got, right? The Emiratis got to prevent annexation. And we are not Emiratis that were late to the party and now we're going to get less than them. I mean, this would be like the end of all and prevent this, delay this. There's a chance of that not happening. I will say that in sort of continuing what you said, Ibrahim, it's not just the de facto annexation that's happening. Like, if I'm Smotrich, I'm just like continuing my quiet business, because the changes that they did, the administrative changes that are so boring and really hard to follow, we do have really good explainers at IPF, but really those technical things mean that the de jure annexation has already happened. Okay, they transferred authorities within the Ministry of Defense to a new entity, and this. So in a sense, why bring this up? Why get Arab upset? No, seriously. Why get Arab upset? Why get the debate? Just continue doing what you're doing and you get the whole thing. So this is my view, but honestly, I don't know.
I would add to that only, I think we've seen in the first administration quite a few times a number of things that President Trump did, which were very symbolic, also meaningful, but things like the declaration of the Golan, or the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, they were, I think part of that was really wanting to do these things and be able to say, and we've heard him say it even standing next to Netanyahu a couple weeks ago, I did, list the number of those things in my first administration, and now I'm going to keep going for Israel. There was a sense, and I was in government for the first year of the Trump administration, and for each of those things, there was weeks of conversation where the sort of traditional bureaucrats and professionals among us and the intelligence community would be saying, but all these terrible things will happen, right? Americans will be attacked, embassies will be stormed, riots in the streets, and none of those things happened. And we saw over and over again President Trump sort of calling the bluff of conventional wisdom in a way that I think we have continued to see, and on this issue too, I wonder if Saudi-Israel normalization is still in the cards, and there is some understanding of the extent to which real, big annexation, more than little pieces perhaps of the Jordan Valley, would really make that difficult, then we see something like the U.S. changing its policy such that it calls the West Bank Judea and Samaria, instead of, I think we call it the Palestinian territories at this point. I don't even know exactly what the official terminology is. So something where it signals that the U.S. is on a certain side doesn't really make a material difference other than sort of the symbolism of it, or perhaps annexing the Jordan Valley or letting Israel annex the Jordan Valley, but parts that were part of the Trump plan anyway. So it's kind of giving an inch, but not giving up on the whole regional grand bargain.
Why don't we take a couple of questions to get more in, and we'll try to give brief answers to get to as many questions as we can. I'm going to start over here. Actually, I just hand up, please. Yeah.
Something you can share.
Hey there, good evening. Thank you very much for being here. My question to you all, and especially to Ibrahim, is about Palestinian succession. Mahmoud Abbas is 86, I believe, and certainly not getting any younger. And I think about last year, we heard a lot of talk of Mohammed Dakhlan coming into Gaza. I think Hamas was pushing for Marwan Barghouti to be released in the ceasefire because they thought he could be a leader. Could you talk about kind of who you see as maybe the next generation of leadership among the Palestinians? Thank you.
Syria. Assad fell. Hamas is not happy. Hezbollah is not happy. The Russians are not happy. The Iranians are not happy. And Israel has now moved into southern Syria. Who are the people that have taken this over, and how likely is it that things are going to stay peaceful there? And
President Abbas is actually getting 89, as Shira said, going 90, still attentive, very, when it comes to domestic politics, is very autocratic, very authoritarian, and recently there are attempts still to bring closer inner circles to positions of power around him, so he's not planning on departing anytime soon. Now, in terms of succession and how it would unfold, we have, he issued a constitutional declaration recently, and he laid out how this would come about in the event of vacancy by stating, the position of the speaker of the PLO, mixing up between the PLO and the PA systems, and basically saying 180 days, 90 days initial period, could be extendable by another 90 days, and it's elections that would determine who the president would be. I think, so that's basically where we stand on this, and I think in real life, we don't have institutions. So what he calls the PNC is like gathered of people who are handpicked. Every 20 years they actually meet. That's the PNC. The PLC is dissolved. The parliament that was elected went wrong. Hamas was there, divided, and it was dissolved in 2018. And an entire generation of Palestinians under the age of 35 have never, which is 70% of people, because it's a very young, society, have never participated in elections, have no means of actually participating in political life or impacting, influencing, advocating. All of that is non-existent. So we end up in a situation where we have to guess on a few individuals which one will actually be more relevant, whether it's Dahlan, Marwan, and which is a sad reality. I'm one of those who actually believe that these institutions need to be revived. Younger people whose names are not mentioned in this room because they have no opportunity to actually be mentioned, but they are 10 times more qualified than the names that you mentioned. I think someone who's been in jail for 25 years is not going to get Palestinians anywhere, in my opinion. Someone who's corrupt and actually works as an advisor to another authoritarian regime in the region should actually, become the president of the Palestinians. By the way, by virtue of occupation, and I know it sounds weird, but I have to tell you that Palestinians are much more influenced by Israel and, the principles of democratic governance than any other people in the area. And that, I think, is something that was cut in the middle, and because of the conflict, especially, when Hamas took over, the process of elections did not really sort of like take its toll. Like every 4 years you have to go back and do elections, because if this has happened 6 times before we got to 2023, I think you would see and see different names. In short, to answer the question, sorry, it may have taken more than I should, but I just want to say that if Abu Mazen sort of like suddenly leaves, I don't think that there is one single person who can actually fill that position. It will be divided and will go through a difficult transition until we get into a situation where we have one leader in one position, because he holds 4 positions. And he only laid out a clear succession mechanism to one. So,
question on Syria, but before you answer, I'll just plug that Ibrahim was involved in a project looking at reforms of the Palestinian Authority that Israel Policy Forum will be publishing within the next week. Tomorrow, sorry.
I hope.
I hope. Please, Syria.
Okay, it's not a short answer, but we have El Jolani, who is now known as Al Shara, changed his name, coming from Al Qaeda and Jabhat al Nusra and then HTS. There is caused. I think we need to be cautious about this new government, although there's a lot of excitement about it and prospects for a positive, there's a fork in the road, and there's a positive prospect for Syria, but the onus is on them to prove that they're really going in a different direction. The situation in Damascus is improving, where a lot of the investment is, because that's where the Europeans comes and other comes to see. My understanding is that in other places in periphery of Syria, the situation is very volatile and not stable. And one of the indication to this is the fact that you have 1.3 million Syrians in Jordan, most of them coming from the south. Most of them actually are sympathizers with HDS. But I don't know, how many of them went back since Assad fell? Only 40,000. And it's because the situation on the ground there is not good. So even Jordan is concerned, right? There's an advantage of not having Assad on the other side, but there's also issues with having an Islamist regime that we don't know the direction and the extent to that they govern their territory, what it means. I think from the Israeli perspective, and Rachel and I discussed it also, we went to the Golan to see, the Golan Heights has been the border with Syria has been effectively there was peace with Syria without having peace, right? This was the quietest border since 1974, since the buffer zone was decided on. And even during the war, this is what people don't know, while the Golan was the quietest place, they had a siren maybe once a month or less, whereas where I live, it was many times a day, right? So it was the quietest place. When Al-Shara, Assad fell relatively quickly, right? It was like a few years and then 11 days. But when Al-Shara fell, we got all the signals from this new Syrian government that they're not heading toward conflict with Israel, trying to reach out in peaceful ways. This is not, and their rhetoric has been promising. Israel took out the strategic weapon arsenals, which to me I think it made a lot of sense, right? You don't know who's coming. Israel always preferred the devil they knew, Assad, right? So implicitly, this was the preference. But what Israel also did, because scarred by the trauma of October 7th, the idea is like we have to distance our population, our border communities from the enemy, even when there's no clear enemy. So what Israel did is invaded Syrian territory in several places. There's the Mount Hermon, but also apparently in, depending how you count, but a few other places. And there's construction of what looks like military bases. And this is where our fear is that you gain very small tactical military, benefit, because really there's no threat at the moment from there, and also you see the terrain is flat, but you're risking, and Rachel alluded to this before, a strategic blowback, because now you are creating an enemy in Syria, and there is deflection toward Israel. This is the playbook that we always know, and what we're trying to say, and I think talking to also people here in Washington, is like at least that Israel would signal that this is temporary presence, right? Temporary presence in demand for this return, or doing something constructive. You don't get this in right-wing groups. They love getting the WhatsApp messages of like Shabbat Shalom from the Golan, from the Syrian Golan. Really, it's like it goes really well with the political base. So it's very hard to understand this. Now, I'm not actually like, I don't know if we should be optimistic. I think the skepticism is merited. But what Israel has capabilities. There's a strong air force. They need to bolster the border community. I know but I'm old school. I don't think we should infringe on someone else's sovereignty, but we'll see. So that's
the only other thing I would add to that is Israel also sort of has Turkey on its border. I mean, Ashara has not pledged allegiance to any one country. His first visit was Riyadh. He's trying to sort of play a lot of different geopolitical actors, but whereas I think Israel had kind of figured out how to deal with Assad, how to deal with Iranian militia in Syria, how to deal with Russia on its border. There is not a good relationship with Turkey. So another consideration is how do you deal with potentially a Turkish-backed regime right next door? And we don't have the U.S. playing sort of intermediary right now. We're not good at state building, and there's a lot that the Syrians can do on their own, but you don't have sort of the traditional U.S. diplomatic role to keep folks in the right lane.
Time for just one, maybe two. We'll take one here, please. Yes. I think the microphone is coming to you.
I have a very simple question. The last question to Ibrahim was about the succession to Abbas. My question to Shira is, what about the succession to Netanyahu? Thank you. Because I'm not sure who it would be.
I really don't know. It looks like if Bennett would run the next elections, he could be prime minister, but I don't know. There are young folks that are coming out. There's different organizations, civil society organizations. There's an attempt they all want to go into politics. There's an attempt to have them join existing parties and not start new ones. The game is going to change, but it's going to be, if I had to put like my money on someone now, and I'm not good at gambling, it would be Bennett next elections, it would be Netanyahu, but if not Netanyahu, Bennett.
Yes, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what Israel Policies Forum's position is on the conflict vis-a-vis both in the region and in the United States, where I understand you also seek to have influence.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate that very much. Israel Policy Forum looks to be a voice of reason and thoughtful policy ideas and education. Half of our work looks to the Washington community, the policy community, where Shira is leading our research endeavors with partners such as Ibrahim, where we really want to create pragmatic ideas grounded in the challenges that are here now, how to move forward, how the United States can play a productive role in advancing a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one that addresses the national aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians between the river and the sea. A two-state formula today is out of fashion in the discourse, frankly, both in Israel and within the Palestinian arena. We believe that there is still no better alternative to a two-state formula to provide for Israel's future. That is three core elements that drive all of our work. That is an Israel that is secure, an Israel that is a homeland for the Jewish people, and an Israel that is democratic, that shares both values and interests with the United States. So that work, the policy analysis and research we do in Washington, is really seeking to provide U.S. policymakers with pragmatic ideas to advance to that goal. And we also convene programs like these in the Jewish community, and particularly we're proud of our program engaging with young professionals, which we call IPF Atid, the word for future, which is, I think, one of the fastest growing and most engaging, dynamic communities of young people across the United States, having really challenging, thoughtful conversations about the future of Israel, a secure Jewish democratic, and the future of this conflict. And in fact, right after this program, it's a great plug, right after this program concludes, in a few minutes, we'll be meeting in the Beit Midrash with the young folks, 20s and 30s, I'm sorry to call you young folks, with the IPF Atidniks who are among us to continue the conversation in the Beit Midrash. We have communities all over the country, 8 core chapters where we're creating ongoing dialogue, education for communities of young people nationwide. But all of our work is driven for a long-term commitment, a U.S. policy that creates a better future for Israelis and Palestinians, and a secure Jewish democratic Israel. Thank you. And with that, I'll thank you all. I do want to thank the JCRC and Adas Israel for being such exceptional partners. And I think it's really important to also mention, when talking about our work, the uniqueness of having Israelis and Palestinians in dialogue in a pragmatic way about where you move forward from here. And it should go without saying, but it maybe needs to be said as a thank you to Ibrahim. It's especially not easy to come straight from Ramallah to a synagogue in Washington, D.C. to have such conversations at times like these. And I want to thank you for your partnership.
Thank you.
And these are the kind of programs that we seek to do with communities across the country. And I, again, just want to thank the JCRC and Adas Israel for your partnership, and look forward to continuing the conversation with the IPF Atidniks in the Beit Midrash. So thank you very much.